It's Wednesday, May 22nd. The war in the Middle East is now 229 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. In the early hours of Monday, just before we were about to go live here on this program, the news broke that the International Criminal Court, the ICC, issued arrest warrants against two Israeli senior leaders. I saw you guys. Yes, you, the ones asking us to weigh in real time on the move. But it was still early, and I was not quite ready. I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV. I needed to talk to some friends who had actual expertise on the matter. That's all I did on Monday and a bit of Tuesday as well. So now I have informed analysis that I'm ready to serve up here for you live right here on the FDD Morning Brief. But before I do that, I need to let you know who our guest is going to be today. It's Brett Schaefer. Brett is the J. Kingham Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a terrific shop in Washington. Brett is an expert on the complex matrix of dysfunctional international organizations. That can't be fun for him, but it's good for us because we'll be able to pick his brain this morning about the ICC and perhaps a few other rotten international organizations that should get defunded or even sanctioned by the United States government. We'll hear from Brett in just a minute. But first, these are my thoughts. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants on Monday for 3 Hamas figures. Great, right? Well, it also issued arrest warrants for Israel's prime minister and defense minister. And as President Biden declared, this attempted moral equivalence cannot be tolerated. Let's unpack this a little. First, ICC prosecutor Karim Khan was negotiating with the United States and Israel about what the possible charges might be before he announced them. That's your first clue that this is a kangaroo court. Oh, and guess where the ICC gets most of its evidence? The UN. And guess where which UN agency has the greatest presence on the ground in Gaza? The UN Relief and Works Agency, an agency proven to be a partner to Hamas. UNRWA has provided military and technical assistance to the terrorist group since 2007, if not before. Then there's this. The ICC is trying to nail Bibi and Gallant on charges of siege warfare. This is a Hail Mary. It's exceedingly rare to see this charge leveled and even rarer to see it stick. Karim Khan knows that Israel put its own troops in harm's way to deliver aid and prevent famine. He also knows that he can't get Israel with what FDD's Ord Kichri calls a shooting violation. The IDF has kept civilian casualties far below other wars that America has waged in recent years. So what happens next? The U.S. will likely sanction the ICC prosecutor, will defund the court, and try to convince other major funders to do the same. After that, who knows? But the international system has failed us yet again. This simply cannot continue. Now for your headlines. Headline 1. The IDF said on Tuesday that it intercepted drones coming from Syria and Iraq. In the north, the IDF intercepted what it described as a suspicious aerial target approaching the Golan Heights from Syria. Down south, the IDF shot down 2 drones headed straight for Eilat. My FDD colleague Joe Truzman shared extraordinary footage on the platform known as X. He showed extraordinary, or rather ordinary, beachgoers watching that interception in real time. Those Iran-backed proxies don't stop. The Iran-backed Islamic resistance in Iraq took public responsibility for the attack on Eilat. Iran-backed groups in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen have relentlessly peppered Israel with drones and missiles over the last 7 months. And don't forget about Iran-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon, which launched some 60 attacks against Israel just last week. Headline 2. 3 former Syrian Assad regime officials are being tried in France for war crimes and crimes against humanity. These are actual war crimes, not like the fake charges being brought at the ICC. The trial began yesterday. The defendants are the former head of Syria's National Security Bureau, the former Air Force intelligence director, and the former head of investigations for the military. The 3 men who are being tried in absentia stand accused of torturing and killing a father and his son in 2013. The defendants are the most senior Syrian officials to be prosecuted in Europe for crimes committed during the Syrian civil war. Good on France, right? Actually, not so much. Just as the landmark trial got underway, Paris decided to endorse the ICC's bogus charges against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes. Come on, Macron, do better. We know you can. Headline 3, Israeli authorities confiscated broadcasting equipment from an Associated Press office in southern Israel. They took a camera, tripod, and microphones, and they shut off AP's live feed of Gaza. Israel's communication ministry said that AP was possibly, but not necessarily, violating Israeli law by providing footage to the Qatari propaganda organ, otherwise known as Al Jazeera, which is banned in Israel. There's still lots we don't know, but we do know that Qatar last year was caught passing information to Hamas about IDF troop locations. Jerusalem apparently warned AP last week that it was breaching Israeli law. AP defied the Israelis, apparently, so then the Israelis moved in. It was quite a scene yesterday. Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid slammed the move as an act of madness. This is a serious international media outlet, after all, 53 Pulitzers and counting, I believe. Israeli Communications Minister Shlomo Karhi defended the move, insisting he was just enforcing the law. But not even 24 hours later, Karhi ordered his staff to return the equipment. I'm curious to see if AP goes back to sharing footage with the Qataris now. Stay tuned, but this is messy business. All right, it's time to talk to Brett Schaefer. As I mentioned, he's an expert on international organizations. He even served time advising the UN General Assembly. On Monday, he published a piece right after news broke about the ICC. He explained why the U.S. should oppose the organization's attempts to target Israeli officials. He's joining us now to discuss that topic with us, among others, live here at the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome, Brett Schaefer.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, Brett, let's first just talk about this allegation that Israel has been withholding food from the people of Gaza. How do you respond to that based on the facts that you've seen?
Well, this is a narrative that's been going on virtually since the beginning of the conflict. The UN Secretary General, other officials in the organization, including Martin Griffiths, who's the head of the OCHA in the United Nations Humanitarian Agency in the United Nations, have said since virtually the beginning that there has been hunger, starvation, or threat of starvation, and other things due to Israel's restriction on humanitarian supplies entering into the Gaza Strip. Now, Israel did constrain things at the beginning. At first, they wanted to make sure that whatever supplies were going into Gaza were not containing weapons or other materials that would help Hamas in its conflict with Israel. Second, they wanted to make sure that whatever was transpiring and going into the Strip was helping the Palestinian civilians rather than Hamas itself. So there was some constraints in the beginning, but since then, there's been quite a bit of effort on the part of Israel to actually supply and facilitate humanitarian supplies into the Gaza Strip. Israel reports that there are some almost 550,000 tons of materials that have gone into Gaza, including food, including water, including medical supplies, shelter, other materials necessary to help the Palestinian civilians in terms of their suffering during this conflict. And Israel, according to experts, in fact, John Spencer, the chair of urban warfare studies at Modern War Institute at West Point, has said repeatedly that Israel has gone to extraordinary lengths here, lengths that nobody other party to a conflict has ever gone to in terms of a conflict, in facilitating humanitarian assistance and other supplies into a conflict zone, and taking steps to try and protect civilians in the Gaza Strip. So this is not an issue of Israel constraining humanitarian supplies. In fact, quite the opposite. Israel has gone to extraordinary lengths to try and provide those humanitarian supplies to the Palestinian people. In fact, it is Hamas that is actually responsible for a lot of the civilian suffering here, including using civilians as human shields, misusing civilian facilities, UN facilities, including UNRWA schools, UNRWA hospitals, placing their tunnels deliberately under civilian facilities to use them as, or in essence, use the laws of armed conflict against Israel by placing their facilities there and therefore endangering civilians as an effort to try and protect them from retaliation and legitimate military strikes.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I think the Israelis early on probably did themselves a disservice. There was, quotes that we saw from people like Yoav Gallant who said that, nothing was going to go in and that he was going to refuse to allow things to go in until the hostages were released. And you can certainly understand why he would issue that kind of rhetoric. But I think the it seems like the ICC has used that against him. And certainly we're hearing that from pro-Hamas pundits in the U.S. media, that they're actually citing him on that. But I also think
it's important to note that in the ICC announcement that Prosecutor Khan issued the other day, it was very cursory in overview. I mean, it was several pages, and they outlined the broad strokes of the charges that are being lodged against both the 3 Hamas senior leaders and the 2 Israeli officials, Benjamin Netanyahu and Mr. Gallant. But they didn't go into detail. They didn't really cite the evidence that they're using to put those charges in, and that comes later in the stage when they will actually present a document outlining the evidence that they have to bring these charges to bear.
Yeah, I totally agree. And obviously we need to wait and see. But you can absolutely, in reading that charge sheet, you can see that there was far more specific information about the Hamas figures and far less specifics about the Israelis. But I'll also just note here, I mean, I visited Cyprus about a month ago, where there is this significant facility and infrastructure that's been put in place to be able to make sure that massive amounts of aid reach that pier that the Israelis have agreed to construct, and now it's actually complete. So the U.S. stood that up, and the Israelis actually have personnel in Larnaca right now reviewing and assessing the aid that's coming through. They're scanning it. They're making sure that it's safe to deliver, and there's now finally a process that's put in place. There was, I think, a steep learning curve, and I think that's okay here, as long as I think the Israelis have made good. But it does seem that the ICC wants to try to hang Israel on those initial challenges and stumblings that we saw early on. But let me just ask you this. I mean, there's also the question about the things that Israel has done to protect Gazans from harm. I mean, I'm thinking right now about the 950,000 people that Israel has moved out of Rafah, for example, right? They're doing that in advance of whatever is going to come next in Rafah. They're not trying to harm civilians. They're trying to get them out of harm's way. So are there other examples that we can look at right now that would show that Israel's actually gone to great lengths to make sure that civilians are safer?
Well, I mean, you just look around at what Israel's done. In the initial stages of the conflict, they did telephone calls. They texted Palestinians, telling them, "Hey, we're coming in. Please evacuate so that you're safe from whatever potential conflict may result in the area that we're entering into." They put out maps and leaflets that they dropped on the Palestinian in Gaza, showing people where they're going to be and where the safe areas are going to be. I mean, this is unprecedented. This puts Israeli forces in more danger, because it's essentially telling Hamas where Israel plans to be. And they're doing this. They're endangering their own soldiers out of a extraordinary effort to try and protect Palestinian civilians from being inadvertently harmed. And these steps are crazy. I mean, I say crazy, but it's just unprecedented. The U.S. would never have done this, for instance, in the war in Iraq. Would never have done this in Afghanistan. Would never have done. You would not have forewarned your adversary about your plans and your routes of entry into a conflict zone. And the fact that Israel is doing this is unprecedented, and I think is very, very underappreciated and underreported.
I'll tell you what else I think is underappreciated and underreported. The Israelis have actually been holding off on their operation in Rafah since March, right? I mean, first we heard about the concerns about Ramadan, and then we heard about the concerns about the 1.4 million displaced people in Rafah. So the Israelis held off on what was a necessary final phase of this war, and we're still seeing them hold back, right? I mean, they're fighting kind of with one hand tied behind their back, but all the time that they have been waiting to do this, they have been giving Hamas the opportunity to prepare for ambushes and IEDs and other kinds of unpleasant booby traps and things in all the tunnels that await in Rafah right now. And it's really unbelievable that the Israelis are getting zero credit. Well, actually, maybe it is believable at this point, but it's frustrating. I mean, I think, there's no other way to describe it. But Brett, look, I noted earlier that the ICC may be drawing evidence from UN sources in Gaza. And there's obviously only one primary agency on the ground there, and that's UNRWA. And we all know the history of this Hamas partner agency. But I need to ask you, I mean, what troubles you most right now about UNRWA? I mean, what would you say that we should be looking at when we talk about a rotten agency like this that is somehow still limping along in the Gaza Strip, despite all of the things that we know about it?
To me, what troubles me most about UNRWA is its betrayal of a central and core and fundamental feature of international organizations, and that is the principle of neutrality. What UNRWA has become is not a refugee agency where you have international organization going in to provide assistance to a humanitarian crisis. It's become a perpetual de facto partner of the governing authorities in the West Bank, in Gaza, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and is providing what is essentially government services on behalf of the Palestinians. And it's become inside the UN system an advocate for the Palestinian cause, whether that's the right of return, whether that's raising complaints about how the Palestinians are treated, whether that's advocating for statehood, for representation inside the organization itself. The UNRWA has become a partner of the Palestinians and a partisan of the Palestinian cause. It's no longer a neutral party here. And that is a violation of the UN's, of the code of conduct for the UN, which is to be a neutral agency in international civil service, not a partisan operation. And part of that is because of the very nature of UNRWA itself. It was set up to address the causes of a specific population. It was set up originally as a temporary agency. It's become, in essence, a permanent agency. And it is populated by employees who are overwhelmingly Palestinians themselves. And that has colored the attitude, the approach, the perspective of this organization in very fundamental ways.
Can't disagree with anything you just said there. All right, last question I have for you on the ICC. I mean, what happens next procedurally? I mean, what are the things that we should be watching for as this drama plays out?
Sure. So the announcement the other day was that the prosecutor was seeking these arrest warrants. So when they mean by seeking them, they have announced this. They have gathered evidence that they believe is sufficient to justify issuing the warrants. They now proceed to what is called a pretrial chamber in the International Criminal Court, where a panel of judges will assess the evidence and decide whether the evidence is strong enough to actually proceed with the issuance of the warrants. Then, if they do, they will just go ahead and issue the warrants. If they don't, the prosecutor actually can go to an appeals chamber and start the process again. So you saw this process go through with the investigation into Afghanistan. The prosecutor at the time, Bensouda, announced that the U.S. or that the Afghanistan investigation, she wanted to launch a formal investigation into Afghanistan. It went to the pretrial chamber. After a couple of years, that request was denied. Then the prosecutor went to the appeals chamber, and the appeals chamber overturned that, and they proceeded with the investigation. They never got to the point where they issued warrants against Americans, but the U.S. did respond rather forcefully. They applied sanctions to ICC officials. They severed U.S. cooperation in many regards to the International Criminal Court. They pressured it politically. And then the new prosecutor came in after Bensouda left. Her term was up, Khan, and he made an announcement that they were going to deprioritize the Afghanistan investigation. They did that for a couple of reasons. One was, I think, the political pressure that the U.S. was applying. The other is the fact that the Taliban actually took over Afghanistan, and the prospects for cooperation with any kind of investigation went from fair to probably very, very poor. And he thought that the resources of the court would be better applied elsewhere. And you can similarly say that that judgment could apply to what's going on in Israel and Afghanistan and in Gaza as well. The idea that Hamas is going to cooperate with an ICC investigation, I think, is pretty ludicrous. And Israel, as you mentioned at the beginning of this, was actually in discussions with the International Criminal Court about the charges, about the evidence, to try and figure out, okay, what do we need to do to cooperate with this investigation to avoid having an ICC investigation actually proceed to this stage. And that's fairly common because the ICC operates under what's called a principle of complementarity. And what that is that if a nation state, a government, is willing and able to investigate and prosecute individuals faithfully or in good faith, then the ICC has no reason to launch an investigation or to proceed of its own authority into situations like this. There's a lot of evidence that Israel has done that. You look at what happened with the World Central Kitchen situation. Israel investigated it. They issued a conclusion. 72 hours later, they dismissed individuals who were found responsible for misjudgment and that tragic event, and they moved on. They've also investigated other incidents where people were inadvertently killed or procedures were not followed properly, and they have disciplined individuals for those actions. So Israel has demonstrated over and over again that it's willing to investigate and it's willing to hold individuals accountable for either misbehavior, malfeasance, or criminal behavior. That is something that the ICC should be taking into account, but is clearly not. And as you mentioned before, the ICC officials are supposed to get on a plane to go to Israel, and instead the prosecutor got on the television that day, and those individuals never got on the plane, which shows, in essence, that he is yielding to political pressure in this area, not following through on proper procedures or a good faith effort to engage with the Israelis to find out whether this situation is being properly investigated on the Israeli side.
Yeah, I think we're done talking about good faith here, and I can absolutely see the sort of fingerprints of outside actors pressuring Karim Khan. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Brett Schaefer, for joining us this morning live on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you very much.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD's Ruel Marcarek teamed up with CFR's Ray Takei yet again for an op-ed in yesterday's New York Times that explores the Iranian domestic implications of President Ibrahim Raisi's untimely and fiery death. The dynamic Iran-watching think tank duo notes that while Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has often found himself at odds with his country's president, Raisi was perfectly aligned with his ruthless vision. So who will now take the chair of the Butcher of Tehran and thus become Khamenei's next partner in crime? Ruel and Ray offer a few ideas, but they also contend that only time will tell. FDD senior advisor Rich Goldberg has a scathing new piece in the New York Post highlighting the perverse and illegitimate campaign being waged by the International Criminal Court. Rich asserts that this kangaroo court, which wields international law as a weapon of war, must be countered by Washington and its allies. If you like today's conversation with Brett Schaefer, that's a great follow-up piece to read. And finally, my colleague Andrea Stricker published a piece in The Hill underscoring the important non-proliferation concerns related to a potential Israel-Saudi-U.S. mega normalization deal. As much as Andrea wants to see peace break out in the Middle East, she and her co-author, Henry Sikolsky, correctly note that the last thing we want is a bunch of unstable Middle East countries acquiring nukes. Congress must act now to head off a potential deadly arms race in the Middle East. That's all for today, folks. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD and support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. My guest will be former Israeli diplomat Yoram Ettinger. He has some fascinating insights into Palestinian-Israeli demographics and other big-time issues that don't often make it into the headlines. It's interesting conversation coming. Happy Hump Day to all those who celebrate, and thank you for joining. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.